Welcome, everybody. My name's Gary Fortney, and this is The Trend. Good afternoon, everybody. As you know, we talk about three main topics of The Trend. We talk about true crime. We also talk about law enforcement-related issues, and we also talk about regional issues affecting society. So today we got a special guest, Dr. Lindsay Trammell. Dr. Trammell is a board-certified forensic anthropologist, and we're going to discuss what an anthropologist is. She's also a diplomat with the American Board of Medical Legal Death Investigators. She is on staff at St. Louis University. She runs what's called the Medical Legal Death Investigator Training Program, and I'm lucky enough and fortunate enough to have been on staff there for about 32 years teaching, and Dr. Trammell's allowed me to stay on staff teaching there. I teach the role of the homicide detective in forensic death investigations, and also Dr. Trammell works for Vista Law Enforcement Training in the capacity of a forensic anthropologist who teaches forensic anthropology to law enforcement officers. I'll let her discuss a little bit more of her background about what she currently does for the role of a forensic anthropologist. But Dr. Trammell attended the University of South Carolina and has a Bachelor of Arts degree in anthropology. Dr. Trammell then attended the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. She has both a master's degree, Master of Arts degree, and a PhD degree in anthropology. And that's where expertise comes from, is having a complete background in anthropology. Dr. Trammell also worked at a place essentially called the Body Farm. Now, some of you may have read about that or heard about it or actually had some experience reading about that in different books. It is at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And I'm going to have Dr. Trammell talk about what the Body Farm is. Professionals are trained in the understanding of the recovery of human remains for both identification and for various things. Again, you can do the height of somebody, the cultural background. That's a big part of it. So again, so fortunate to have Dr. Trammell. Thanks a lot for attending, Dr. Trammell. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
I know Dr. Trammell is Lindsay, so I'll call her Lindsay, but she did earn the title of doctor, and I really appreciate her being here today, so thank you so much. Lindsay, why don't you explain what a forensic anthropologist is and kind of give a little bit of a background, the definition, and what the most important part is?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, forensic anthropology is the study of human skeletal and cartilaginous material in the medical legal setting.
What's cartilaginous material?
The cartilage.
Cartilage, okay.
So certain portions of the human body are made of cartilage and or bone. So it's studying those, looking for indicators in the skeleton that can give us an idea of if that person was biologically male or female, how tall they were, around what age they were at the time that they passed away. We are specialized in looking for different indicators of skeletal trauma to help contribute to the investigation of cause and manner of death. We're also well-versed in scientific identification methods with radiography and radiographic comparisons, as well as search and recovery of human remains.
Excellent. So we'll talk about trauma to start off with a little bit on skeletal remains. So how does that tie in? Dr. Trammell, I've worked with her actually on some digs and recoveries previously in my capacity of doing some consulting work for various law enforcement agencies. So if you have a human remains, let's say that there's a mark on, let's say, their head. What would you do by looking at, what are you looking for if any type of trauma? Trauma is, again, some type of injury that happened. What would you look for on the head?
True. And one thing that I do, tell everyone to remember is just because there was trauma to the body doesn't necessarily mean there was trauma to the bone. It has to have hit skeletal material for me to be able to see something as the anthropologist. But essentially, I'm looking at, I know what is normal human variation, and I know what an indicator that's going to be more abnormal or more indicative of trauma. So I'm going to look for maybe specifically an impact site or, something that indicates that, high velocity projectile or gunshot trauma occurred, or blunt force or sharp force trauma. So there's different indicators on the bone that will indicate that was likely what happened.
And trauma does not necessarily mean a homicide, correct?
Correct.
And so in your profession, again, you're board certified, which is a very specialized field to be board certified as a forensic anthropologist and also a diplomat for the American Board of Medical Legal Death Investigators. We'll talk about that as we progress a little bit more. You're looking for trauma, but then you're trying to determine cause and manner of death, correct?
So I'm actually not determining cause and manner.
But you're looking for that aspect to give to the pathologist, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So the best way I can describe it is, so the forensic pathologist is the medical professional that went to the medical school. They're the ones doing the autopsy, and their specialty is, gross anatomy and soft tissue. If there's not enough soft tissue, maybe the individual is decomposed, mummified, skeletonized, then the forensic anthropologist can look at the bones and, based on what we see and what our assessment is of potential trauma, then the pathologist can read my report and say, okay, well, she said there is something consistent with, gunshot trauma here. And then they can take that in as well as their exam, law enforcement's reports, and determine the full cause and manner of death.
Well, is it fair to say you work hand in hand with the forensic pathologist?
Correct, yes.
And so your analysis of the human skeletal structure, human remains, that's passed along to pathologists, which assists them in determining what was called cause and manner of death, correct?
Correct.
Explain what a cause of death would be, or explain, like, is there unlimited number of causes of death?
There's a long list of different types of causes of death, because that could be something, again, from if I'm involved, so at the skeletal level, that could be, could be gunshot trauma, could be blunt force trauma to the chest. It could be sharp force injuries. Those are all causes, as are certain natural disease processes, such as heart disease, stroke. But those things, as an anthropologist, I contribute less to.
Well, let's say somebody fell out of a tree, a young kid and a child, and they fractured their skull. You would see the fracture, correct?
You would, if it was substantial enough fall to cause injury to the skeleton, we would be able to see that. Yes.
Yeah, and you look for injuries maybe in the skull or some extremities too, and then based upon the injuries you see, you would help the pathologist determine, was that an accident? What could have been a homicide, so on. And so while there's numerous causes of death, why don't you explain the 5 different manners of death? And that way, that's a very, very big part of assisting the pathologist.
Absolutely. So there are 5 manners of death: homicide, suicide, accident, natural, and then undetermined.
And that is all on the final autopsy report, correct?
Yes.
So, very interesting field. And again, I'm going to get a little bit more in depth about the role of the anthropologist, what you can do during an examination of human remains. I want to talk about you a little bit, though. So what made you decide to go to the University of South Carolina, get your degree in anthropology?
Well, I'm from South Carolina, so
Okay.
I was sticking close to home. I also grew up going to Gamecock ball games, so I've been a fan since I was before I could talk. So I stuck close to home. And to be honest, I was actually, when I went to school as an undergrad, I graduated high school. I was a straight A student. I was co-valedictorian. I was,
You sound like those two. They're all, they had so many ropes and chains around their necks to graduate. I thought they were going to break their necks. So you're one of those then. Okay.
I'm one of those. And then I go to undergrad, so larger school, more difficult classes. I was actually pre-med. So I wanted to go to medical school, but I was majoring in anthropology to be a little bit different than everyone else. And I think it was maybe my first advanced calculus class, and then biochemistry, I struggled. I'd never not made an A before, and I think I made my first B and maybe a C, and to be honest, I panicked.
Was it traumatized? I like these stories, by the way, the human.
So I bailed on the whole pre-med thing because I had trouble with some of the classes, but I was really good at anthropology and I loved it. It came easily. I was very fascinated by, anthropology is really the study of people. So it has numerous different subfields, cultural anthropology, biocultural, medical anthropology, linguistics, archaeology. And so at the University of South Carolina, I was getting exposed to all of those different parts of it, and I loved it. I stuck with my major, but I bailed on the pre-med.
Did you have an anthropology class as part of your major, I guess, when you were going through pre-med?
So since I was an anthropology major, I was taking a lot of the basic courses to introduce me to the different fields of anthropology. I loved them.
So you graduated from the University of South Carolina. How'd you end up in the University of Tennessee, Knoxville? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, when I was finishing up my degree in anthropology, I'm not going to date myself by telling you the time frame. However, at the time, forensic anthropology, it had been a field that I wasn't very familiar with. I learned about it as I finally took my first osteology class.
What's osteology?
Osteology is the study of the human skeleton.
Excellent.
So I learned to look at a small fragment of bone and say, okay, that is this bone. It's definitely human, but I loved it. I had a knack for it. And at the time, there were not a lot of graduate programs that had a specialization in forensic anthropology. And the University of Tennessee was one of those where when you pursue your degree there, you still get the more 4-field approach. You get the archaeology, you get the cultural anthropology, but you can focus on forensics because of some of their resources.
Excellent.
So I applied to go to grad school there. I got in, and yeah.
So you got your master's and your PhD from University of Tennessee in Knoxville. There's a place there that's special and affectionately known as what's called the Body Farm. I don't know affectionately or not. Let me change that. There's a book I think written, The Body Farm. There's some other things out there about that.
Yeah, I think Patricia Cornwell might have been the one that initially coined that. I could be wrong.
Yes, and
but I read her books before I knew what anthropology was.
Have an interest then?
I thought it was fascinating. I never thought that it would actually be real life.
Have you been on the site there? What's the actual technical name?
I have. So it's the anthropological research facility.
And
So
what do they do there? Explain a little bit about that, about the donation part also of
yeah,
the people.
absolutely. I don't know a lot of the details, but Dr. William Bass was the one that founded that, and it's the very first human decomposition research facility in the United States. So individuals donate their remains and designate them for that purpose. So it's to help researchers in the anthropology field and other related subfields understand how the human body decomposes in different types of environments.
If I'm not mistaken, when a body decomposes, all things change. Again, I've seen decomposed body in my role when I was a homicide detective. Putrefaction is what?
It's basically the breakdown of the tissue.
Yeah, and those are technical terms. Again, I'm not an expert, I promise, but I know enough about that reading autopsy reports and being present. Somebody donates their body and they know they're going to decompose, but they do it for the better of science and investigations, right?
Correct. Yeah, it helps us as professionals, again, understand that process. So when we're trying to maybe identify a set of unknown remains, understanding how long it's been since that person passed away can help us communicate with law enforcement. Okay, this is that time frame, and now you can look at your missing persons reports and maybe further narrow down
And that's why it's called time since death, not time of death, right?
Correct.
Completely different. Explain the difference between time since death and time of death. A lot of people see TV, oh, they can tell the person died at this time.
Right, which is incredibly untrue.
Correct.
So the time of death, and this actually does vary by agency. I've learned and by state and how we kind of define that. So I work for my primary position is with the St. Louis County Medical Examiner's Office. So the time of death is the time that the person is officially pronounced to be without heartbeat or without, brain activity. So it depends on, maybe it's a witnessed event where they're being officially pronounced by a medical doctor, or maybe they are found unresponsive with no vitals. And so that's going to be their time of death.
Yeah.
Time since death is our estimation. We're considering a lot of different variables and factors, but the time that has passed since they've passed away.
So that's great for the understanding of the science involved. Let's go back to you a little bit. Eventually, you ended up in Arizona, correct?
Yes.
Explain your role there, because that's where I think you got involved in more of the law enforcement aspect.
Right. Well, so it's a little bit of a convoluted pathway. When I was finishing out my doctorate in anthropology at the University of Tennessee, I was working very briefly as a teaching assistant for some of the basic anthropology classes. And teaching at that time was just not for me. So I ended up sort of taking not necessarily a leave of absence, but as I was finishing my doctorate, I left the teaching position and I got hired on at the Sheriff's Department in Knox County, Tennessee, in their cold case unit. And then as I'm doing that, I end up kind of getting a postdoc position at the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner in Tucson.
Yeah, Pima's in Tucson. So, yep.
Mm-hmm. So I moved to Tucson under a grant for 6 months to work as a forensic anthropologist. And that's where I actually got the majority of my hands-on casework experience working with Dr. Bruce Anderson and really honing my abilities as an anthropologist. I did that for 6 months. I moved back to Knoxville. I finished up my doctorate. And then because I had kept in touch with everyone out in Arizona, I was working in law enforcement. I learned about medical legal death investigation. I went back to Tucson and worked for 6 months as a death investigator for the same agency in Pima County. And then ended up having the opportunity to come to St. Louis and do both of those jobs.
So you ended up back in Tucson and you started working as a death investigator. A very interesting field because on all scenes of deaths, let's say a good majority, you'll have either a coroner representative or a medical legal death investigator, or medical examiner investigator. So how'd you like that when you first got involved in death investigation?
I think it's incredibly interesting. It's something that, you have to have a little bit of the medical knowledge, which sort of circles back to me wanting to be a doctor, but not continuing down that. I am different kind of doctor.
I get it.
So I enjoy that aspect of it. I enjoyed being able to sort of combine my anthropology experience a little bit, but working as a death investigator and, every day was completely different. And I really liked that. It kept it interesting. I was always, and I still always learning, which is a great thing to say about any kind of job.
I'll talk about death investigations quickly. You have to be a hardy soul and you have to be able to handle seeing somebody deceased and dead in all sorts of various ways, trauma related, no trauma related, people in the different stages of decomposition and all that. So it's an interesting field. Again, I've been on hundreds of death scenes, but you're doing the investigative part. So I want to kind of clarify what my position. I knew I was doing it for the victim. And so I got past looking at the gross or looking at the different things. No, you're doing it for the victims. Was that your concept too, if you're doing it for the investigative part?
Right. We're working to help, we're working for the victim as well in a way, but we're also helping sort of be the go-between between, the ME or coroner's office and the family too. So we're helping and we're talking and we're communicating with family the entire time and helping them sort of understand what happened to their loved one, because, they're dealing with one of the worst days that they'll ever deal with. And so we're on scene to, document what happened to the individual, but to also speak with the family and let them know, what's going to happen, how they're going to find out information, when that's going to happen. So
that's great. It's a very noble profession doing death investigations. Not for everybody, but it is very rewarding the part you do. So you ended up in St. Louis here, right? So let's talk about your pathway that got you to St. Louis, and let's talk a little bit about, just briefly, about what you first did in St. Louis and where you're at now, what your main positions are.
Sure. So how I got here, I was working in Tucson as a death investigator at that time. So that was my second round of employment in Tucson. And I attended the American Academy of Forensic Sciences conference. It's every February. It's an international yearly conference. And I think I was presenting a poster on my dissertation research at the time, which was on bone histology. And I met an anthropologist. Her name was Gwen. And I remember looking at her name tag and it said, St. Louis, Missouri. And she was a forensic anthropologist / death investigator. And it was like, that's so cool. You have both of my dream jobs all wrapped into one position. And we exchanged contact information. And when I got back to Tucson, I reached out to her to let her know, it was great to meet you. Thank you for coming by my poster presentation. If you have additional questions. And then I think a few months later, she reached out to me via email and let me know that she had was taking a different job and wanted me to apply for the position in St. Louis.
And that'd be for the anthropology position?
It was an anthropologist / death investigator position. So it was both. Yeah.
Well, good deal. Well, you end up here in St. Louis, and we ended up in St. Louis here. Began as a death investigator, on-site death investigator, and anthropologist.
Yes, correct. I kind of had two jobs in one.
Excellent. So let's jump a little bit forward here now. You are a very busy person. Yes. All right. So let's talk about your current roles and what different counties you work for and what you do in these different counties for the role of anthropologist.
Absolutely. So again, primarily I'm at St. Louis County, but I'm also the forensic anthropologist for the regional medical examiner's office, which is St. Charles, Franklin, and Jefferson County here in Missouri. I've recently started doing consultations for the St. Louis City Medical Examiner's Office. And I've been, for the last, it'll be 13 years in September since I moved to St. Louis. I do consults for numerous other Missouri and Illinois counties on request.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention another anthropologist, Dr. Maria Teresa Terracigni-Tarrant. I first met Dr. Terracigni-Tarrant when she was the forensic anthropologist for St. Louis County.
Yes, she worked for St. Louis City.
St. Louis, I'm sorry.
Correct, yes.
And so I met her. I started teaching at the St. Louis University Medical School as part of the class through her. And she actually taught for us for a while too, but she's since moved on to a different position in Texas, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, she is full-time down in Texas in San Antonio.
So you kind of picked up her duties, correct?
I did. Yeah, she's amazing. She was a great mentor for me. We both actually went to the University of Tennessee. She was, I think, 6 or 7 years maybe ahead of me. And so when she moved here, it was wonderful to have her in the St. Louis region because I could learn from her. We could collaborate on casework. She's done some peer reviews for me. But yeah, she stayed very busy here. And then since she's relocated and has a very full-time position that keeps her busy, I have sort of moved into some of her roles.
Good deal. Well, let's talk a little bit about now on-site. Let's talk about the training first that you do for Vista Law Enforcement, training and consulting, and what we do as far as the investigative aspect. And then let's progress a little bit more to a couple of real cases. When we do the training on site, you've been teaching with us now for about 3 or 4 years. You've been doing quite a few.
Yeah, so, I think it might be longer.
Yeah, so that's great. We actually had remains that we recover and analyze as part of the training program. When we first go there, we do what's called a scatter, right? Explain how training is regarding scattered remains and why we do that first of all.
Right. So we talk about a few different types of search and recovery methods when I teach for Vista. And one of those is surface recoveries. And so to sort of mimic that, we scatter non-human specimens. We know how many we have. We do that in, kind of a wooded or open environment. And we, any of the participants in the course, we line them up so they can kind of do like a mock line search where they are looking for any sort of skeletal material. And if they see something, they flag it. And they know then once they flagged it to ask the anthropologist, is this human or non-human? Is it even bone?
So right, and that's really important. So we do a line search. We have all of us line, have red flags. They pin the flags, and then Dr. Trammell would come up, look at the bone structure, and determine really quickly. By the way, is it human, non-human? I believe Sarah and Allie are very familiar with that. I think Sarah went through the program, so she was part of that. They're running the board today, and Let's talk about scattered remains. Why do human remains get scattered? Let's say somebody either dies or is murdered in a wooded area or an open area. How do the bones get scattered?
So there are a few different things that can potentially happen. So there's a lot of extrinsic factors, especially in an outdoor environment. The natural process of decomposition itself, depending on the environment the individual's in, whether, it could be on a hillside or a bluff, it could be near a creek or an area where there's flooding. So natural weather processes can actually scatter remains. But the thing that happens more often than not is scavenging.
Explain what scavenging is and how that works.
Absolutely. They're, carnivore, rodent scavenging, just natural animals that exist in the environment will actually, chew on human remains, whether it's tissue or bone. And in doing that, they can pull those items apart. They can spread them out for miles. And that's one of the reasons why, especially in an outdoor environment, if you find human remains, they're not necessarily going to be intact and in one place.
Yeah, and the animals or scavengers will take it to certain areas, again, to protect what they're going to have to feast off of, right? And to pull away from original location. So that's why it's so important to understand a body or skeletal structure will not be in the same position if it's scavenged. It's going to be pulled apart different areas. And that's why it's important when you train. Actually, you help train me too about this, of looking for the different scattered areas. So.
Right. In the majority of the instances, you're going to have maybe a primary site of deposition. And you can tell based on looking at the ground and whether or not there's a stain or a change in the color of the soil or the surrounding, vegetation where that individual decomposed. Sometimes you can tell where that primary site was, and then that anything else located was pulled away by potential scavengers.
And looking at the remains, this is one of the most interesting parts of the program. You do a 2-day, I want to say basic, but it's actually a very good program. The first day, you have a lab. We do. Dr. Trammell will put out different bones and different skeletal remains, and you're going to have to help identify, is it animal or is it human?
Right. Yeah, so, I do a few different stations to show participants that they need to call me.
I'll never forget the one that's a hand. And is it a human hand or is it
a bear paw?
Hand? Yeah, bear paw.
Yeah, those are very similar. But yeah, I'll bring skeletal material, the majority of which is either is non-human or it's something that's been donated if it's human remains. And we'll have the class sort of try to differentiate, what is human versus what isn't.
And that's when I realized that I am not an expert. So I can identify skeletal structure, but I am not an expert understanding human versus non-human and other things. So that's the training program we do. The first day is a lab and a classroom presentation Dr. Trammell does. And then we do an on-site dig where we do look for impressions or other areas in a soil where there could be potentially a body buried. And then we cover and analyze that. Let's get to a little bit more detail, though, about what can be done. You have different terminology like taphonomy and these different things. Explain some of the things that can be done when you recover bodies. Some people don't think you can tell race, age, or height. Explain what you can actually do with remains.
So what we can tell, if we have remains that are confirmed to be human, I will do a full inventory. So I'm going to lay everything out in my lab. I don't like to necessarily do any type of assessment in the field. I want to have a more controlled environment where I can really take my time to look at everything. But I'll lay everything out in general anatomical position so I can document and do a full inventory of what we've recovered.
And it's usually on a white sheet, correct? You use a sheet or something?
Something to sort of have, a more neutral background. Yep. And then, like I said, I'll document what I have. And then I look at specific indicators of the skeleton to estimate whether they're biologically male or female based on most often the pelvis, sometimes the cranium. I will look at different indicators of the skeleton to estimate approximately how old they were at the time that they died. It's usually an age range. And then I'll look at the cranium for, we use a term called population affinity. So we're estimating what population group that individual is most likely, a member of based on features of certain measurements and certain features of the cranium.
Do you get involved in identification? Let's say you have a skull recovered. Are you able to help and put the muscle structure and structure together, try to do an identification of somebody that way? I know that's a specialty area.
So there's a specialty in anthropology, like facial reconstruction. No, I did take a Maymester course when I was at the University of South Carolina, and I was horrible at it. My representation looked a lot like Ozzy Osbourne, and not who it was supposed to look like. I'm not very artistic. So it is something that is a very specialized field of forensic anthropology. It's not something that I do.
But it can be done by experts who do that, and you're familiar with the process, right?
I'm familiar with the process, correct.
Let's talk a little bit about the process, about experts in the field. Dr. Trammell recently became a member of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She's also a Team Adam member, in which I've been a Team Adam member for, I think, going on 3 years now. And they do have experts in anthropology and the other aspects. You're actually now as a forensic anthropologist for Team Adam. Explain what Team Adam is and what you do in that respect. And
so from what I understand, because I don't think it's official until the end of May. I haven't been through my training yet.
You're there.
But so from what I understand, I will be contacted in instances where there is a potential missing child. Maybe they've been buried or, potentially like located, so I might be dispatched on search and recovery missions, or I might be utilized to, if they have remains that appear to be that of a juvenile, estimate how old they were, help with the identification process. So it's going to be kind of a case by case basis based on their needs. And I think having somebody in the Midwest region was necessary.
Excellent. Yeah. And so I've been deployed numerous times with Team Adam. And so looking forward to work with you about this. It'll be great to do so. Okay. A lot of you have been waiting. Let's get to the nuts and bolts of a recovery of human remains. All right. It is not dig and pull. But
right.
You just don't dig a hole and start pulling remains out.
I definitely don't want you to do it.
Yeah, I would say Dr. Trammell go from a smile to a frown. So anyways, if you do have possible human remains and you look for what's called depression areas, explain what that is.
Correct. So when you're looking for buried remains, it kind of depends on the time frame. If it's something that has potentially, and your source, right? Yeah. So who's telling us that something has been buried? Is it the potential, suspect themselves? Is it, third person? Is it, somebody is hiking and they see something unusual. So depending on your source and depending on the potential time frame, since that individual has been buried, you're looking for different things. So a lot of more recent burials, for example, you tend to look for not necessarily a depression, but a mound.
Yeah.
Amount of extra dirt, amount of extra debris. A lot of times you'll see recent burials where someone tries to also kind of cover it up, where really they're making it more obvious.
As a body decomposes, though, it doesn't kind of flatten out a little bit.
And it does eventually, correct. Yeah. So when you have a buried body, they still will eventually go through the natural decomposition process where they bloat. And so that'll sort of also push the soil up. And then once they start to decompose and that stage passes, you will eventually, after a longer amounts of time, have a depression where that body is. And that's something, if we're looking for indicators of a buried body that has been, months or years, you'll see more of a depression in the soil.
Let's talk about this. So before we start digging, explain what probing is, what probes do. So it's really important to understand before you dig, we try to assess. So
one of the tools that we can use to sort of potentially locate burial is to use sort of a probe in the ground. And we do that, and we try to feel the difference in the resistance of undisturbed versus disturbed soil. And so, for our course, we know that there is an individual buried and we know where they're located, but we really like to have students be able to feel the difference and sort of outline the margins of the potential area of recovery, because it's going to, depending on when that person was buried, it's going to feel different pushing that probe through a disturbed soil versus something that has not been done.
And one thing, fortunate if Dr. Trammell allows me to be part of the probing, and we kind of let the students feel the hard ground versus the soft that's been disturbed. And I really enjoy doing that. The look on their face when they actually feel like they have it.
Yeah.
So again, I've been part of the training. Again, Dr. Trammell's the expert, but I am part of the program a little bit just as more of an assist person. And so let's say you probe and you have a soil that you believe could have remains. You do a circle around, right? You try to do an outline.
We sort of try to estimate and create a grid. So when we want to do a recovery, we want to make sure it's well documented. So we want to take photographs. We want to, draw schematics. We want to have measurements. So we want to have a grid that's of a set,
like a parameter kind of, or just
correct. So we want to know the measurements of our parameter. We usually want to have something where you have certain, an equidistant between points, and we set up a grid with nails or flags and string, and then we sort of just excavate in a systematic manner, layer by layer, within that grid system.
So do we just fill the dirt in a pile, or what do we do with the dirt once we have the dirt in the buckets?
So we screen everything. Any of the soil that may be potentially part of that burial, whether it's above it or below it, once we've recovered remains, we will screen everything.
And what screening means is we have shaker screens and sifter screens. We sift the soil.
Correct.
That's the most difficult part of
it. Is especially in Missouri because the soil is primarily clay. So it essentially just kind of rolls up in balls and we have to dump it.
So the course, or students that attend the course, we have interns that are there too. They actually do the sifting, the breaking up, and they look for the remains. And we just don't dig deep, right? You do a layer down.
So we do layers at a time and we don't ever, unless I give you the green light, we're never going to use a shovel. Everyone's going to use trowels because we don't want to damage the remains. We don't know, if we are dealing with a burial, we don't know how deep it is. And so the last thing we want to do is cause any damage to the skeletal remains. So we dig slowly with trowels and we take it, one layer at a time, because we want to be able to document if we found any type of evidence in those layers. So we want to know where were those items in relation to where the skeletal material is.
That's a great what I want to talk about is evidence. You're just not looking for skeletal remains. There can be evidence, right? Inside
there could be, depending on, generally someone's not going to jump into a burial voluntarily and bury themselves. So if they're in that type of environment, it's very likely that somebody else was involved. So we're looking for any evidence that could indicate that.
Cigarette butts where they were smoking, throwing them in there. How about gunshot or shell casings?
Potentially, yes.
Anything. So anything can be inside the grave, because if they're going to bury a body, they're going to put possibly evidence in there too. It could be guns, anything in there too. So when we're sifting, as Dr. Trammell has trained us, we're looking for skeletal remains. All looking at anything unusual that is not part of the dig that would be a natural formation, right? So it'd be all anything that's seized. So if you find a part of a skeletal remain, do we just pick it up, or what do we do in place?
No, I would love to have everything contained in the burial. We want to leave it in place.
Yep.
Because what we really want to understand is how that body is positioned in the burial. So we really want to excavate the soil from around it, and we do something called pedestaling, where we excavate around the skeletal material, get the dirt out, but leave everything else in place.
And we also take photographs as we're going down, layer by layer photograph to document everything in place too is very important. So I think documentation is so important. We do hand sketches along with photographs. I'm not too big on video. There's other reason why I'm not too big on video. I like still photographs. Mm-hmm. And when I was a homicide detective, we did video of crime scenes, but I'd have to have a computer or some other type of project. I like putting photographs in front of me to view still. So we do have something called, are you familiar with the Faro machine? So
the what machine?
Faro. It's a machine and a device that actually does a 3D view of a crime scene. Again, with Dr. Trammell being the anthropologist, this is more for the law enforcement. So we have what's called a Faro. It spins and makes a 3-dimensional diagram of the entire site, and that's actually good to show the site, which is utilized more in the law enforcement aspect, versus Dr. Trammell is involved in the recovery and analysis of the remains. So let's say we're going down and down, and you find a skeletal structure. It's going to take some time, right?
Yes, it is. It's a very tedious process. It's something that is not going to happen in less than an hour.
Yeah, we're talking hours. And again, taking your time is so important. And when we do our course, we only have pretty much the long bones that are buried.
Yeah, we don't bury everything, because we don't want to lose any of the donated material, especially the smaller bones. And, bones eventually over time buried, they will start to kind of degrade depending on the soil context too. So we don't want to damage anything.
Well, if you have a foot, or if you have a hand, how many small bones are there that you can miss and stuff? That's why you look for the big bones.
Right. Well, that's one of the reasons too, when we're screening, we're using quarter inch. So those things are not going to go through that screen. We're going to catch those small bones.
Yeah,
teeth.
We actually, Vista have the screening equipment. We actually help with when we do a cold case work for screening. We have different sides of the screens. Big, that we can actually go smaller, screen a little bit smaller. So it's very important. So we do the heavy lifting on the sites, and says Dr. Trammell having to do all the screening and digging, but she does the analysis and helps the students. So let's go to a real scene. So you start seeing skeletal remains, and you're talking hours to actually
do the recovery.
Yes. Weather gets in the way, right?
Weather could definitely be a factor, and it's something you need daylight for. It's very difficult to do any type of recovery research. When it's dark.
So the remains are recovered after the sifting, documentation, diagram, photographs, and then remains are seized. Law enforcement does not seize remains. Okay.
Correct.
So explain the seizure of remains and what the process would be after you got the remains documented, recovered, and what do you do then?
Right. So this is where even as a death investigator too, the medical examiner or coroner's office, we have jurisdiction over the remains or the body.
That's correct.
Law enforcement has jurisdiction over the scene. So we want to collaborate and work together. But the ME or coroner's office, we're going to be the ones that, we actually use a conveyance or transport service most of the time, but we put the remains in a body bag, we seal that, and then they get transported directly from the scene to the medical examiner's office. And at our office, for example, anyone that comes in, depending on the circumstances, our pathology staff will check them in. They will take photos of them, unlocking the body bag. They will take photos of the remains. They will take radiographs of the remains. And usually, especially the pathologists I work with, they want to take one look at them first with me before they, completely defer to forensic anthropology.
And when they defer, that means Dr. Trammell will actually lay out the bone structure, usually on a white sheet, something to show a contrast, and lays out in proper anatomical position, correct?
Correct.
And you're talking from small little bones in the feet to larger long bones like the...
Yes, everything is laid out in its approximate proper position.
All right, let's get to the good part here. So let's say you have a body that's being recovered who is in a stages of decomposition. You don't lay those out with the people with the let's say tissue, muscle matter. So what do you do? So we're going to get into a little bit of a graphic part. That's what Dr. Trammell does. Let's go over the entire process.
It's a process called maceration. So essentially what we are doing is we are removing that soft tissue from the skeletal material to better look at what is going on or not going on with the bones. And there are a few different methods. What I use is one that's been, recommended and published. So it's essentially using kind of an Alkanox water solution, very minimal Alkanox.
Is it warm or cold water?
So I use an incubator, heats the water. It's never boiling. That can actually damage skeletal material, but it heats it at a steady temperature in a contained environment. So essentially, the remains will be soaked in this aqueous detergent solution and then checked on periodically. And I use forceps and toothbrushes to clean the tissue off the bone.
The worst thing Dr. Trammell or other anthropologists can do is examine a bone structure or skeletal structure with tissue still on.
It's a lot of times, especially if it's decomposed, it makes it difficult to fully be able to visualize what's going on the bone. Especially if there's trauma. But certain circumstances sometimes warrant us maybe not removing all of the tissue. If the remains are burned, it can damage them. So
do you ever reach in with your hands and strip tissue off bone structure?
My gloved hand.
Yeah, definitely gloved hand. All right. So I don't want to get too graphic here, but the clean structure, which I've actually seen them do, they use their hands, forceps, other devices to clean the bone structure. If it means getting your gloved hand in there to remove and to have it pristine, that's really important, right?
Yeah, we want to clean the tissue off, and we don't want to use any type of instrument that's going to potentially damage the bones themselves. So we're being very careful.
Yeah, if you put a defect or some type of mark in the bone structure, it could hamper you trying to see if there's some type of traumatic injury or something.
I mean, it could potentially obscure that, but it's something, if I accidentally do, I know what happened. I can document it. I can put that in my case note so it isn't confused with trauma.
That's really interesting because the expertise it takes, and that's why I say, Dr. You earned the title of doctor because it's such a very, very comprehensive training program, and the knowledge that you have to be able to do this is really important. And let's say you get the bones clean, you got all of the physical matter off, or biological matter off, and they're laid out. So I want to recap a little bit more. What can you tell from recovered remains? Let's talk about what from unknown remains to what you can, and talk about the role of the forensic odontologist too, if you can.
Sure. So depending on what we have, so let's just say we have almost an intact, full skeleton. So we have everything that we need to figure out who that person is. So what we'll do is I've done my inventory. I will focus, if I want to figure out if the individual is biologically male or female, I will look at the pelvis or the hips. I will look at the cranium, and I will make observations, take measurements, and differentiate, again, male or female. And then I will look at other certain indicators to assess how old that person is. So I do look at the dentition. So a forensic odontologist is a forensic dentist. They can be very helpful with documenting teeth. Anthropologists can do that as well.
Yes, you get that.
So it depends on our training. It's something that I've been trained in, but I will collaborate with an odontologist. But we can look at dental x-rays and the teeth, especially if they're a juvenile, to get an idea of how old they were at the time that they died. Otherwise, we're looking at, are all of the bones fully formed and fused? Is that individual an adult? If they are, then maybe we're looking at, again, features of the pelvis or maybe the ribs or certain bones to look at, how recently they fused or how they're starting to break down. And we'll be able to estimate within a range how old that person was when they died.
So let's recap. You can tell the gender, correct?
So yeah, we use a different term.
Yeah, but I'm just a retired homicide guy. So anyway,
yes, we can estimate biological sex.
Okay, biological sex. So let's talk there. So biological sex, first of all, race or culture.
So population affinity, essentially which geographical population group this person is most likely a member of based on features of their cranium.
Height?
Yeah, we can estimate stature. So we will take an estimate of one of the long bones and we put it into a software program. That's something that we most often do. There are a few other ways to measure stature, and we'll get a range.
Weight?
Possibly. Again, that's going to fall under the that's going to fall under the population affinity assessment and whether or not that person might be. Yeah.
Okay. Again, I apologize. I'm not using the proper term, but
You're fine.
I'm just a homicide guy, but
no,
I'm not an expert. But
you're fine.
I understand the basic. I understand enough to be able to help in the investigative process, which we have done before. We'll talk about a real case study. I was involved in required recovery and analysis of human remains. How to get a real case study. It's been adjudicated. I can talk a little bit more about that in the future. So we got all the identification processes now, correct? And after you have all those parameters of who, as best you can, the person was, you look for traumatic, right? Or traumatic injuries. How would you define the word traumatic injury?
So what we will look for is something we describe as perimortem trauma. And that means trauma happened to the skeleton when the bone was still fresh. So it breaks in a specific type of way. It responds to force and stress and strain in a certain type of way. So I will look for that in every type of case. And so the way the bone is behaving will give me indications of whether or not it was blunt force, sharp force, projectile.
I'd really like to do a subsequent episode with you, talk a little bit more details about the examination. But if let's say you see a hole in somebody's skull or cranium, and you have, let's say it's a bullet wound, entry and exit, you can look close and you can make I don't want to say estimate, you can make probably pretty good determination of the entry and exit wound.
Correct. So generally, if certain, variables are met, a gunshot, entry defect will be roughly circular with radiating and concentric fractures. The exit defect will have what we call external beveling, where essentially that projectile is sort of punching that bone out. So yeah, there are very telltale observations we can make with, projectile trauma and say, this is consistent with a gunshot entry wound, or this is consistent with a gunshot exit wound. Every once in a while, you'll see something that's a little bit more atypical, like keyhole, where something maybe goes in at a tangent.
Tangent means sideways, right? A little bit of
at an angle.
Yeah, angle. Let me talk about how that would play into my position as a homicide detective. Why would I look for entry and exit points in a head? And it could be signs of suicide, right?
Correct.
Would somebody commit suicide by putting a gun on the top of her head and shooting downward? Generally not, right?
Generally, probably not. That's where you come in.
That's where we come in. Okay. So, and I'll do an analysis of the traumatic injuries based upon the forensic pathologist and forensic anthropologist. And we see, are the wounds consistent? What would be usually a suicide or a self-inflicted gunshot wound, or is it a homicide? And we do that, and we do that along with interviewing potential witnesses, suspects, and so on. So it all ties in together. So that helps us determine. I actually had a case I worked where we found a body buried. This is in the early 90s, before we had the ability of Dr. Trammell to be on site. We did an excavation ourselves, being the crime scene guys, all right? And we determined it was a suicide. Somebody buried themselves, covered themselves up, and committed suicide in the grave by gunshot wound. So, but the help that Dr. Trammell would have provided on site would have been big to us. We still solved it. So the expertise that has developed throughout the years, I was first in homicide 1986 to today, is so important, having the experts such as Dr. Trammell part of the process. And so I can't tell you how important it is for me to learn about this. I'm learning every day, to be part of some excavation sites and the training we've done throughout that. And for Dr. Trammell to allow me to teach at the medical school for the medical legal death investigator training course. If you had another field of study, what would it be? Or is this it?
I love what I do. I think honestly, if I had stuck with the medical school route, I would have really enjoyed pathology. I've never been as big of a fan of people.
You don't have to worry about it too much. You are an expert, and based upon being board certified and what you do, and recovering remains, there's a lot more to it than we just talked about in the first episode. Would you come back for a subsequent episode?
Yeah, absolutely.
That'd be great. I wouldn't mind talking a little bit more in depth about this. We'll get everybody's appetite wet a little bit. We'll talk about a little bit more details about the recovery and analysis of remains, a little bit more detail how it works. We'll talk about maybe tying into an actual case. We'll talk about the case that's been adjudicated, and a little bit about how that works on identification process. If you have human remains that are either buried or scattered, doesn't mean that we're not going to find out what happened.
Correct.
And when I say we, it's all of us working together, right? Because
it's definitely a team effort.
Team effort. And if I ever used the word I know it's in this previous episode, it's never I, it's we, because we got the medical professionals such as Dr. Trammell and the pathologist and the medical legal investigators on site, the prosecutor's office for criminal aspects, and then the law enforcement working together. And I can't tell you how fortunate I am to meet Dr. Trammell in my professional work, as well as the consulting that we do for Vista, and her training law enforcement officers in doing the right thing. Sometimes it's going to the scene not doing anything. Calling her is so important versus doing something, but an assistant is a big part of it too. So you work well with the crime scene investigators?
Yeah, we all work really well.
And same with the role. Okay, we got not 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
How would you describe the role of crime scene investigator versus your role as anthropologist?
So again, it's kind of coming back to that same concept where, the scene is their jurisdiction and the body is mine. But we want to understand the context of the body within that scene. So,
documentation, right?
Yes, absolutely. Documentation is so important. So they're taking their photographs. I'm taking my photographs. And we're both making sure that we have everything we need before anything is manipulated or moved.
Yep. And believe me, it could be a big help for law enforcement team. They can do a lot of heavy lifting. They can do some analysis, looking for scattered remains. Again, one person, you can't do it by yourself.
No, especially if we have, a scatter or surface scatter in the woods, or if we have a burial, we need more than just me. So it's something where, when I tell law enforcement that I can help with this, I can be the person that, runs the whole thing for them, the whole recovery, or I could be an extra set of hands. But having the anthropologist is so important because, can prevent damage to the remains. We can get a better recovery. If you're going to find animal stuff every single time, especially in the woods.
Every time.
So having me there is going to save everyone time.
And also saving to have a shovel mark or a tool mark inside a bone can really make a difference for Dr. Trammell's examination. Hey, I want to thank Dr. Trammell for attending. Again, Dr. Trammell did and still does scene investigations. She's mostly now doing the coordination for the anthropology aspect for the regional medical examiner's office, which covers a lot of counties, a lot of different things, and also her teaching and her coordinating the program. So thank you so much for listening. I really, really enjoy what I do, having the podcast and having experts on as guests. And again, stay well. Stay informed. Again, we are The Trend, where we have the facts without the politics. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of The Trend. Thanks, everyone, for tuning into this episode of The Trend. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to reach out to us at The Trend's website at www.trendmediallc.com, or you can email us at any time at thetrend@trendmediallc.com. We welcome everybody's comments, suggestions, or reviews. Don't forget to stay connected with us on social media. Follow us on TikTok and Instagram at Trend Media Podcast, and join the conversation on Facebook by searching The Trend Podcast. Check out our Amazon page through the link on our website, where you'll find some of our recommended products. We'll be back next time with more true crime stories, insights on law enforcement trends, and current trends with our region and the people we serve. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay part of The Trend.